Hello and welcome to Baiju's Exam Prep IAS. Welcome to the big news of the day. Today we are going to discuss the CIPRI report which was recently published, which has ranked India's military spending as the third highest in the world. But before we start the discussion, let me remind you that in 3 days, our target prelims crash course is all set to begin live on our YouTube channel. So don't forget to attend these sessions every day from 7:30 to 9:30 p.m. to revise all the important current affairs that are needed for your upcoming prelims. Now coming back to our discussion, CIPRI or the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute has brought out its annual report on global military spending, and India's military spending for the last year has been ranked as the third highest in the world. This clearly points towards India's aggressive military modernization in the face of increasing security challenges it is facing from both China and Pakistan. As tensions with both the countries have gone up over the last 4 to 5 years, India's military spending also has gone up in order to modernize and gear up the Indian armed forces to deal with the twin threat. The report also notes that India's defense modernization is driven by increased defense imports along with a greater focus on indigenous procurement of defense platforms. With regard to global trends in military expenditure, the report also notes that global military expenditure has reached record levels despite the pandemic. So it is in this context, it becomes important to examine the CIPRI report. But first we need to know what is CIPRI. CIPRI stands for Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. It is an independent international institution that was founded in 1966 and it is based out of Stockholm. This institution mainly focuses on armed conflicts, military expenditure, arms trade, along with disarmament and arms control, and publishes periodic reports on military spending, nuclear arsenal of various countries, with the objective of developing accurate data and scientific research on issues such as conflict and cooperation, with the goal of contributing towards peace and stability in the world. For publishing these reports, CIPRI sources its data mainly from open source intelligence that is freely available in order to enable governments, media, think tanks, and the public to make informed choices and to be aware of global military expenditure. This year's report points out that global military expenditure for 2021 has reached an all-time high, and for the first time, it has crossed the $2 trillion mark and has touched $2.1 trillion, which represents a 0.7% increase in global military expenditure as compared to last year. This record level global military expenditure has been noted despite the challenges created by the pandemic, and it points towards increasing militarization around the world. The chart over here clearly depicts the top 5 military spenders, with United States at the top position with an annual expenditure of $801 billion that accounts for 38% of global military expenditure. But interestingly, as compared to the previous year, the US has reduced its defense expenditure by 1.4%, and while it has reduced its arms procurement, it has increased its expenditure on defense research and development. Then China comes at the second position with an annual spending of $293 billion, and it points towards China's aggressive military modernization. And despite the secrecy surrounding China's military expenditure, the CIPRI report notes that China's military expenditure has steadily grown for 27 consecutive years, which happens to be the longest uninterrupted sequence of hikes by any country. Then at the third position, we have India with an annual expenditure of around $77 billion that accounts for 3.6% of the global military expenditure. This is followed by the United Kingdom and Russia, and Pakistan has been placed at the 23rd position with an expenditure of $11 billion. The top 5 military spenders, that is US, China, India, UK, and Russia, they account for 62% of global military spending. And as expected, Russia's military expenditure has gone up significantly in the last 6 to 7 years, as its tensions have increased with Ukraine and the NATO countries. In fact, Russia has been spending nearly 4% of its GDP on military expenditure, as compared to around 2 to 3% for other top spenders. The CIPRI report also helps us understand the major weapons exporters by their market share for the last 5 years. And clearly, the US takes the top position when it comes to military exports. It accounts for 39% of global defense exports, followed by Russia, France, and China. Now, let us take a more detailed look at India's military expenditure. According to the SIPRI report, India's military spending has increased by 0.9% as compared to 2020, and it has gone up by 33% as compared to 2012. The report clearly points out that India has given a greater priority for military modernization through a mix of defense imports, but with greater focus on self reliance in order to promote indigenous development and procurement of arms and weapons. But one key observation from the report is that out of India's total military expenditure, most of it is spent on revenue expenditure as compared to capital expenditure. According to experts, this is the reason why India's military modernization has been hampered because out of the total 5.2 lakh crore defense budget for this year, majority of it, that is around 2.33 lakh crore rupees out of it, is being spent on revenue expenditure such as salaries, day-to-day operational cost, and pensions. It's interesting to note that the pension bill for the Indian Armed Forces is massive and it accounts for 1.2 lakh crore rupees as pensions which are paid out to over 3 million retired servicemen. While pensions are well deserved for the ex-servicemen, the government has been struggling to increase capital expenditure on defense, and most of the defense budget is consumed by the revenue expenditure itself. The capital expenditure for this year accounts for just 1.52 lakh crore rupees. But the silver lining is that 68% of this capital expenditure budget has been reserved for domestic indigenous production and procurement, and 25% out of it has been set aside for research and development, not just for government entities such as DRDO, but also for private companies and startups. But the point of concern is the high revenue allocation as compared to low capital allocation. The chart over here clearly depicts the high revenue spending on Indian Armed Forces as compared to very low capital expenditure. This directly hits procurement of modern arms and weapons, and the high salaries, high pension bill, and the high day-to-day running cost continues to drain the defense budget, thereby affecting India's military modernization. So what does this mean for the Indian Armed Forces? See, the low capital expenditure directly affects the modernization plans, and it leads to critical shortages of key arms and equipment. This concern has been flagged by the CAG as well, and in its report, it had pointed out that the Indian Army lacks ammunition and cannot fight a war longer than 10 days. Along with this, the lack of concrete long-term plans to systematically build up the strength of the Indian Armed Forces and their capabilities, and the lack of focus on inter-service prioritization, along with inter-service rivalry and weak domestic defense industrial base, has added to the problems of the Indian Armed Forces. But over the last 6 to 7 years, the government has focused on defense modernization and has tried to promote self-reliance in order to give a boost to the domestic defense industry. As pointed out earlier, 64% of the capital outlay has been allocated for indigenous defense production and procurement. But the problems plaguing the domestic defense industry and the inability of the government to increase the capital expenditure as compared to revenue expenditure has directly hit the modernization plans of the Indian Armed Forces. This comes at a time when India is facing a grave and serious challenge from both Pakistan and China, and hence, in order to overcome the critical shortages that are affecting the Indian Armed Forces, India has tried to speed up defense procurement with greater focus on indigenization and self-reliance. But the big question is, can the Indian domestic defense industry deliver? And can the government and the Ministry of Defense provide the right kind of support to the armed forces and the domestic defense industry? But a silver lining for India's defense industry is India's increasing defense exports over the years. According to this infographic shared by the Ministry of Defense in 2017-2018, India is now exporting defense products to more than 42 countries, and the value of Indian defense exports has gone up considerably in the last 5 to 6 years. The government has claimed India's defense exports have increased 7 times between 2016 and 2019. And according to a latest report tabled by the Minister of State for Defense last month in the Lok Sabha, India's defense exports have gone up 6 times since 2014, with the total export value touching 11,600 crore rupees as compared to a meager 1,900 crore rupees in 2014-2015. Amongst India's defense exports, roughly 50% of it between 2017 to 2021 were meant for Myanmar, thus making Myanmar the biggest defense importer from India. This is followed by Sri Lanka at a share of 25% in the Indian defense export share, followed by Armenia at 11%. At the same time, it is important to note that the SIPRI report has pointed out India has reduced its arms imports for a while over the few years, but it still continues to rank amongst the world's biggest defense importers. With this, I would like to conclude today's discussion. Thanks for watching.